Spot Barbecue.
And I'm Giggleklutz.
And today we are talking about Inscryption.
Inscryption, as described on the Steam site, Inscryption is an inky black card-based odyssey that blends the deck-building roguelike escape room-style puzzles and psychological horror into a blood-laced smoothie. Darker still are the secrets inscribed upon the cards. This came out in 2021. The developer is Daniel Mullins Games. The publisher is Devolver Digital. And the price on Steam at full price is $19.99. And we did play, as from almost all the games that we talk about, we played the Steam version. And on Daniel Mullins' website, I want to give you just a quick description of who he is, because this is one of the rare instances where this is kind of a figure-headed project. Let's just call it that.
Yeah.
And when the development is done by the guy's named developer, that's probably the case. Anyway, on his website, which is danielmullinsgames.com, it's who is this Daniel Mullins guy? My name is Daniel, and I'm an indie game developer living in Vancouver, BC. Before I released Pony Island, I worked in the games industry as a programmer, but now making indie games is my full-time gig. I'm the primary creator of my games, but that doesn't mean I do it all by myself. The talented Jonah Senzel makes music and sound effects, and I sometimes partner with 3D artists when an extra dimension is needed. So that brings us into kind of the developer side of what Inscryption is.
Yeah, notably, he made Pony Island and The Hex as well, which are both beloved games, and also, like this game, touch on a sort of horror layer. So, before you play this game, if you ever decide to play this game, do note that it does touch on some darker topics, and we're not going to dive too deep into some of those darker topics, except maybe an aspect of self-harm, and that's just what I would like to warn you about before we continue to talk about this game and its approach to aesthetic horror. So, when you start off this game, aside from interesting menu, you are in a dark cabin, and the person across from you is just a set of eyes looming in the darkness. And when you get up from the table, you can see, well, a cabin. It's a wooden cabin. There's dark corners, couple blood stains. There's old, worn, just objects throughout the room, such as skulls or fascinating figurines. There's a lot of mysteriously strange, almost unsettling objects throughout the cabin.
And there's a lot of dark corners you can't see into.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, mainly you're sat at a table, play a card game with a mysterious, shadowy figure on the opposite side of the table.
Mm-hmm. Like, you cannot see him, although sometimes he does wear these masks, and you can see the mask, and his eyes will change to fit these masks, and in general, though, he is an enigma.
When you start the game, you know you're going to play cards. It's set up to play a card game, but you're not given any rules, really, and you're not told what the stakes are.
Mm-hmm.
That's important to the immersion of the game. You know, it's like, that is one of the horror aspects of it. It's like, you don't know what the stakes are of winning or losing this game. And that's pretty clear, like, from the get-go. It's everything about the entrance is sinister. This isn't a friendly game of cards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a layer to it, and at first, it's not quite clear. He does, foreshadow that something bad will happen to you. You do need to win my game. But it's only when you lose that you really see the effects of this.
And it's set up that you will lose. You're not going to win your first round of the game.
No. There are precautions in order to keep it that way. You'd have to get very, very lucky. Because I have seen it happen. I have seen it happen once.
Too lucky.
Too lucky. Too lucky. Too soon.
So, talk a little bit about why you call it horror aesthetics, because you've been talking with us a lot about that.
So, a lot of horror games, while there is an atmosphere that comes with horror games, a lot of the time the game itself is against you. There are enemies in the game against you. There are things that will jump out at you from the darkness, instead of the darkness just being there. And I think that kind of sets most horror games apart from aesthetic horror games, where horror games, as a blanket, are trying to elicit a deeper sort of fear, rather than just build a sinister place for things to happen in. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
So I think where it applies to Inscryption is just kind of how Inscryption is a card game, playing a virtual card game that's in a horror setting, not horror about cards.
Exactly this.
Yeah. There's things that are creepy, and there's things that are going to be uncomfortable to do as a player character, but it's different than fighting for your life in an actual horror setting where you're supposed to completely identify with the character. There's an insulation there that's really kind of hard to explain, but it's there. It's supported in that. And I think using the medium of cards helps a lot, to where there's this distance between the
player and the things that happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's like this game is not at all trying to make you paranoid every time you hear the sound of shuffling.
Yeah. God,
that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, this game does have the approach of it wants to be fun. And it wants to be fun more than it would want to scare you. And I think that's really cool, as a person who shies away from a lot of horror games because they're kind of intense. I don't like feeling scared, like I'm gonna pee my pants or screaming. And I feel like a lot of people can agree with that as well, that they want to play games that have some darker themes or aesthetics but don't want to be terrified.
And I think Inscryption here does that really well. I think it does embrace a horror aesthetic without being a strictly horror game. There's a lot more going on than just... Fear is not the primary emotion of what's going on in this. There's a lot more... I don't know, what is the emotion that's I don't know if I want to make this choice kind of feeling, rather than...
I guess there's apprehension, or unsettling, or do you have a word? You come up with great words, Sackbot.
So, I don't know, it's just it's horror largely comes through in just kind of a dreadful undertone. Very dread.
Love that. Yes, dread.
Yeah. And one of the major ways that comes through is that the main mechanic of the card game, when you're introduced to it, is to use your cards, you have to sacrifice cards already in play. And the way they talk about that is with a knife icon that imagines stabbing the card.
All the cards are animals, and the cost you have to play them is blood.
Yeah, and eventually bones as well from the death of other cards. So every single card is played because of death. And that does lend itself very well to the aesthetic the game has built around.
Dread.
Dread.
Where even winning doesn't feel good, because you had to sacrifice. Sometimes the cards will talk to you and ask you not to sacrifice them. There's dread involved in that.
I guess it's not just dread, it's this, consistent level of morbid going on.
Yeah, and even the bosses themselves have expressed regret for having to fight you. I think every single one of them are noted as oh, yeah, sorry I had to fight you. Now that you've beaten me, here, have a gift, such as items that can be used, or prices in shops are cheaper, because there is a shop, but that's getting more into some mechanics of the game itself and how it expresses this brand of horror. Are we ready to get into that?
Oh, yeah, if you are.
Yeah, I'm just along for the ride here.
This game is the chosen pick of our Honeyshuckleex.
That's me.
Who is our resident deck builder strategist and statistician because of long-term Pokemon playership.
Yeah, I have experience with, like, turn-based and strategy and also lore, which this game has. We're gonna get into that a little bit later. But that was kind of our spoilerish free section of the game, just talking about the tone, and it basically applies for most of the game. But now we're going to get into mechanics, and the mechanics themselves, over time, are spoilers kind of in themselves. So this is kind of our first spoiler warning.
Which is minor spoiler warning.
Yeah, we're not going to spoil the plot necessarily, but we will spoil some of the depths of what there is to discover. So if you want to play the game, this is a good time to take a look at the mechanics.
Yeah, and there is a demo that you can have for free if you just want to try it out for yourself.
Yeah. Because, sometimes that's just all you need to scratch the itch. Just, like, okay, this is what it is. Cool.
Not for me! Alright, so in the mechanics.
So the game is a roguelike deck builder, escape room, and an RPG, and a found footage, and a different kind of RPG, all in the same game, all with different mechanics, all compounding information that you get from playing this game. And it's a lot to get into and a lot to unpack and a lot to learn from being dropped into it. Because your opponent in the cabin, Leshy, gives you a very basic tutorial of how cards are played. And when new mechanics are introduced, they don't talk about those mechanics in the same way. You're just supposed to play with them and figure out what they do, instead of being taught. And on the one hand, it's kind of cool to figure this out. On the other hand, it can be overwhelming.
To be dropped in the deep end, yeah.
Like, for example, in my very first playthrough, I got to the point where there were two kinds of cards added. The Mox method of playing cards and the Energy method of playing cards. And I picked the Mox. And it is like you need to sacrifice part of your play space in order to play. Like...
Yeah, that's a good description of how the Mox works. But, yeah, I mean, each one requires you to sacrifice something. I mean, the whole game, if you read up on where the game came from, was developed in a, God, what are those called?
Game Jam.
A game jam, yeah, where the theme was sacrifices must be made. So, yeah, the theme of all the card dynamics in here is the idea of sacrifice. What are you going to sacrifice in order to play something else? And lots of card games use this mechanic in different ways. This is just thinking about it a little bit more literally because it was based on that theme.
Yeah. And I think inadvertently, one of the things that was sacrificed was clarity.
That's yeah, well put. Is in making it this complex and trying to do as many things as this game is trying to do. And we're being super vague when we talk about this, because Act 3 of this podcast is going to be more about lore. And in order to maintain the mystery that leads to the lore, you kind of have to be dropped in the deep end. They need you to be confused. They need you to not understand some things. My problem with the game is not actually a problem with the game. My problem with the game came by being introduced to it by a person in my life who's incredibly enthusiastic about the game, does not want to spoil it for me, doubles down on the dropping me in the deep end by giving me enough hints to skip past the grinding that I would need to understand things so I don't get frustrated with the mechanics, because I'm being shown it by a deck builder guru.
Hi, that's me.
Right. So, the deck builder guru is dropping me in the deep end of a game that already drops you in the deep end and then says, go for it! And I'm like, what? And you get bonuses by pulling out your own teeth? What? What?
Here, you need to make a thing to give to the boatman, maybe, or the devil, unclear.
I don't know. It's creepy, and I'm filled with dread now. Thank you. And I'm like, it's fine. It's deck builder, and it's making me uncomfortable. But why does my kid love this? Why? I know they do, and I know they've got good taste. So I'm gonna stick with it. And I know I can't ask because then that's the spoiler, and they don't want me to be spoiled. But what I'm saying is,
it was very difficult to figure out where to help and where to hint.
Right. Partially because, and here's another thing that you'll find out listening to these podcasts, is me, Giggleklutz, I value anticipation over spoilers. I don't necessarily care if I'm spoiled, especially if what you're going to spoil is going to enhance my understanding of what's happening. Because if I can put things into better context, I enjoy myself a lot more. I do not enjoy being confused. I really don't. Meanwhile, that's exciting for you for some reason.
I love mechanics as puzzles. Just give me a starting point, and there's a lot that I can figure out. Simply because I've played a lot of different games, and a lot of games who give you this sort of thing reference things you might know from playing other games. And, I feel like, Sackbot, I feel like you're kind of a midpoint between our two extremes.
Yeah, that's definitely how I've thought about it myself.
Is there anything you felt when, uncovering some of these mechanics?
In Inscryption.
In Inscryption. I know that I was, there in the room, so there was a lot of times where I would be like, ooh, 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 I know a thing.
Yes.
But is there anything that comes to mind?
Sigils.
Sigils are cool.
Yeah, basically they're an ability that a card has to do special stuff on the field. Normally they have, health and, attack power. But then you got some unique property bestowed upon them by a sigil, a symbol on the card.
Yeah.
The thing that makes sigils noteworthy is not just the fact that they give cards unique properties, is that you can apply them to cards that don't normally have them.
Yeah.
And this is true in several different sections of the game.
Yeah, I think only the midpoint of the game you can't do this with. The rest of the game you can, just in different ways. And how you decide to do this can greatly impact your experience or how the game itself goes. Do you guys have, a favorite sigil? It can be, gameplay-wise or power-wise or just concept-wise?
I don't know if... I was just coming into my own by the late game, so I don't know if that's too spoilery to talk about.
I think we can generalize, maybe, I don't know.
I like the one that, when your card dies, it goes back into your hand. That's a good one. I like that one.
I like that one, yeah.
Yeah.
That one was the most fun to play with. And
mm-hmm. It definitely opens the door for a lot of weird strategies.
Mm-hmm. And when you can compound that with the card that duplicates itself. when you have a card that duplicates itself and goes back to your hand when it dies, you never run out of cards. Especially if it is one with a low cost to play, which, yeah, that's the one mechanic that we haven't really talked about, but it's the fact that you earn ways to adjust not just what cards are in your deck, but what those cards are. You add things to the cards you already have, or change things about them in certain ways, and that mechanic also is thrust upon you in ways that's kind of difficult, okay, what's the cost for doing this? How does it affect it over time? That kind of thing.
Yeah, because, at the beginning of the game, how this is done is you take one card and you basically combine its properties with another card, either through having two of the same card combined into one, or the sigils from one card applied to another card.
Yeah, you just slice the sigil off one card and stitch it onto another one.
Yeah, you know,
That's not the exact context for how it happens in game, but that's about the tone.
Yeah, about.
The character adjusting your card for you tells you to look away when they do it, just to give you some idea.
And then you would kind of hear like a hacksaw, and there's some
squelchy noises.
And
squelchy noises.
The card itself is covered in blood.
It just...
Like I said, dreadful and morbid.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's like a primary example of how these mechanics kind of support the atmosphere that the game is trying to build, which I think is really cool, and it's something that it does very well. I think that the mechanics that they introduce at the end and somewhat in the middle, they don't do near as well. I'm going to just simplify this as circuits and mocks, but circuits especially. The basics is what it does is the circuits sacrifice 2 spaces on your board to power up your other cards on the board. And it's introduced too late, and it doesn't do enough for you by that point to really feel useful.
It's asking you to give up a comfortable, established mechanic for a recently introduced one that doesn't have as deep of effects, is what it seems like to me. So it's like, too little too late? No thanks?
It's like, it's on par at most with other strategies. It just doesn't... It's introduced at such a point where you can't really build a deck around it anymore.
Mm-hmm. And, maybe it's intentional. Maybe it's leading into a lore standpoint of, the person you're playing against. But then there's also just, from a replay standpoint, you still can't use this because it's introduced so late in, you barely get time to experience it or experiment with it. And that's kind of sad.
And that's the case while you still have access to your former mechanics. Mm-hmm. So it's if you still have access to the former mechanics, why would you throw away everything you'd already learned to try and invest in a whole new deck building strategy
that you don't even know is going to work?
And you're not quite sure what's on the line still.
Mm-hmm. So that is one of the things that Inscryption, I feel does not do well, is this sort of introduction of deck types is introduced kind of poorly.
And that's fine. It doesn't have to do everything well.
Of course.
Well, you could get into the mindset that games have, if a game is going to bother doing anything, it should do it really well. I'm like, no, all games are going to do some things well and some things not so well. And so if you play the game and find yourself not adapting to new strategies very well, know that that's a common experience playing the game.
Yeah, I'm just thinking it's good games have water levels in them, so... It's there's gonna be some room for some hit and miss stuff in any game, no matter how good it is.
Yeah. Honestly, we could probably do a whole episode on water levels, but that's not now.
And you lost me for a minute there. I'm like, there's a water level in Inscryption? What are we talking about? Was that a Sonic reference I missed? What's going on? I'm confused again, and I told you guys I don't like that very much.
I'm just citing it as, water levels in video games in general are usually misses and not hits.
Right, yeah. No, I'm getting it now, but I was leaning into obtuse is funny. I don't know, you can tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, I'm laughing.
I know you are, but are you laughing at me?
I like to think with you, because you're making a joke.
I am making a joke. We're good.
That'd be like a clown who's upset that you're smiling. That goes against the whole point.
Not of horror clowns, but,
It's the clown up there, honking the red clown nose, and it's just hey, stop laughing at that, I have a condition.
Oh, God. Okay, there we go. Yes, there we go.
I mean, that's a great joke, but if a clown meant that seriously, my goodness.
Okay,
alright.
So then we played the whole game, and of course, Honeyshuckle played it first, was excited about it, had Sackbot and I play it again while she sat on her hands, and hoped we would make it and she could help us have a fun experience without spoiling it for us, and that's always a delicate balance. I want to honor that and not be upset with anything or sound upset about anything I'm not.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to openly admit that I did not do a great job, but hopefully I can do an even better job in future games we play.
I mean, this was happening, like, intertwined with, Tiny Room, Town Mystery. So it's like, this was, like, during the beginning of our time just playing games together in general.
Right, and it took some time to figure out how to do that well, how to play single-player games together. There's a knack to it, and not all games lend themselves to it very well. This one is a mediocre one. It's like, if one person really jives with these kind of mechanics and, if they're really good at deck builders, if they're not the one playing for the first time, it can be really hard for them to understand what the other people are going to need and what they're going to need to know. And there were whole bunches of lore secret stuff that you discover independently, but separate from that gameplay that she loved, but didn't want to spoil for us, but it also didn't share her enthusiasm for. So it was hard for me to lean into mechanics that don't suit me super well to play a game that my kid loves for a reason that she wasn't sharing with me. So
oopsies.
It's fine. We're learning a lot about communication playing these games, and we're discovering where that lies and trying to explain it to you guys. So thank you, audience, for being here. You're making us better communicators by making us try and figure out how to talk to people about this stuff that we love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that nicely kind of wraps up our mechanics discussion and playing together discussion. So now we can do our final spoiler warning as we go into Act 3, where I actually talk about the lore and a little bit about the story and what kind of lore this is. Like, it's really fascinating stuff. If you're really into lore, then do some digging yourself. I highly recommend it.
So this is an extreme spoiler warning at this point. If you are going to be disappointed and the game is going to be ruined for you if you know the secrets, discover for yourself whether you want to play it for real now before you move on to this next bit.
Run for it!
Alright, so this, as a Daniel Mullins game, a lot of people who have played the previous games know that he likes to spearhead games that are genre-bending, that play with meta, that play with perception, and Inscryption is no different on this front, because all three of his, biggest games, Pony Island, The Hex, and Inscryption, all take place in the same world, which is an sort of alternate version of our world. And in this world, AI video game characters, they're sentient. Maybe not all of them are sentient, but a noteworthy amount of them are, and they can influence our world and be influenced by our world in a heavier way than you might think. And, it's a type of meta-narrative that I haven't seen anybody else do to this extent. Because there are plenty of games out there that will, for example, reference what's on your computer because they already have access to it. They could pull up, for example, what you're called on Windows, or let you browse for images or whatever. This goes a little bit different.
Well, I would encourage you to talk about what you mean by meta. In the Stanley Parable, you're the player moving a player character in a very real and tangible way. In this one, there's another added layer on top of that they don't disclose to you until after the first act.
Yeah.
In between the first and second act, they actually let you know that, wait a second.
Yeah, at least that's when it's heavily implied, and then there's an official reveal, hey, if you didn't pick up on this by now, this is what's happening.
You're introduced to your Stanley a third of the way through the game.
Yeah, because while you do have a found footage horror movie, you are playing this game through the perspective of the person who is recording it.
Right, who's in the found footage.
Yeah, so your whole playthrough is basically the found footage. And it's only really displayed as clear at the very end, although if you're good at story reading, then you can typically pick this up as you start Act 2.
Mm-hmm. So, what is it that entices you about this lore?
So, there is, the concept of video game characters being sentient, but a lot of the time, when this happens, they are, bound to their game, and they have a very limited understanding of what our world is. This game has a deeper connection to the real world through what is called the old data. The old data is able to sense or grow or something corresponding to things that happen in the real world. And as such, the characters in the game are aware of real world events and might react accordingly. For example, the person who had this game before our player character, or the perspective character, or whoever, the person who had it before him died. And before she died, she buried this in the woods. But the characters in the game know how she died, even though they probably shouldn't, because it was covered up and left kind of obscure, but they know, because it's in this old data.
Okay, so now that we put a spoiler warning in, you don't have to be quite so vague.
True, yeah.
So in actual terms, you find out that, okay, so you're playing a video game with a card game in it. Okay. Well, it turns out that the character you're playing is kind of like a Stanley, and it's this guy named Luke Carter, who, after you finish the first act, you find out through found footage he created is that he was playing a card game and found coordinates on it to go dig up something in the woods. It turns out it's a disc, which has the Inscryption video game on it. So he starts playing the video game. Well, when he's playing the video game, he's...
It's should be noted, in the first batch of found footage, you find out that the game you've been playing is a video game adaptation of the fictional card game Inscryption.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Which nobody knew existed, including this card collector who is making these videos.
Mm-hmm. And he plays it, and he starts wanting to know more about it, especially because of all the weird things that happen in this game, and he tries to contact the developers of the game, who are actually, it's a callback developer to his previous game, the Hex, Game Funa. So this is where it starts to link to the previous stuff, and that's weird and wild, and...
So the stuff I didn't know, because I'd never played Hex and had no idea that this was part of a larger universe... is that some of the characters overlap. There are people in Inscryption from Hex, but because of the way the world works, they're not just callbacks, because this is a universe where video game characters are sentient and alive, so they're all AI. So this one came back to be in this game. It's like an actor playing, not even just playing another character, it's like a contractor coming back to do a job again.
Exactly.
And it's
and it's something
I did not know this playing the entire game. I found this out kind of today when Honeyshuckle was telling me about really what the lore means to her. And video game characters, most people in this universe do not know that they are alive, which means we don't know exactly how widespread this phenomena is. Is it with every single game? Is Mario in this universe a sentient person? We don't know. What we do know is that these games in particular have sentient people in them. Sentient AI. And they don't have the same kind of morals we do. They very fey.
Very fey. And their motives can sometimes be beyond understanding. I mean, the main antagonist of the game, Poe, for example, just wants to replicate, kind of. He wants to be in control of as much as possible. And...
Colonizer.
You know what? Yeah, I mean, that's bad.
Yep.
And I just, in general, find that really fascinating to think about, because in this kind of, like, it gets you to question about, like, at what point would something be like this be their own person, and how detectable would it even be?
And how much do we have to care?
How much do we have to care?
Right, because if a digital life form exists to live this life where we sacrifice them now and again, but that's kind of how it goes, and it doesn't really seem to faze them much besides temporary discomfort, how much do we have to care about it? Here we are, back to uncomfortable again, and dread, but these are the questions. And it's interesting that even without knowing the deeper lore, this is inherent in the whole thing.
Yeah.
Like, knowing it adds a richness to it that was there the whole time. And I don't know, I think it might have enhanced my experience to know that about the universe I was playing in before I started. Good to know for future stuff.
Yeah.
Because, I think that definitely would have enhanced my Inscryption experience, and I would have cared less about the mechanics and less about making sure I find and solve all the puzzles in each of the rooms I'm in, or find all the objects, or any of that.
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of introduced it to you in the same way that I introduced myself to it, because, like, I'd heard of Pony Island and the Hex. I'd never played them. I just heard that they were meta-narratives, and I didn't know how much they built on each other. Like, I will say, I do think that maybe you do get more out of this if you have played the Hex beforehand, but it's not necessary. It's just definitely a richer world if you have played them. I haven't heard the same said about Pony Island. I think it's kind of more of a proof of concept at that point, but...
Which sounds typical from what I've read around the developer and the development of this particular project in particular. So, Sakban, what do you think about how the addition of the lore background about how these characters that we're bumping into had lives, one outside this game, and kind of outside the scope of what we're trained to think of as the video game itself? Yeah, here I went and did it too. Ask you a question with no answer. Like, hey, what do you think?
Well, when you consider the idea of digital life forms that are sentient living people, how can we confirm that we too are not digital entities in a video game? How do you know where the boundaries of reality start and end? How do you know that behind some building you never bothered to walk past, they haven't modeled the other side of it?
And I would be like, by understanding how game development works, and about how art works, and about how these are thought experiments to play with these ideas, and they don't actually give any evidence that any of this is actually possible, so we don't have to worry about that?
Yeah, I mean, like, if for example, we are a simulation, right? Our world is not contained but like, in between, like, some traffic cones in the road. I could walk past the traffic cones and go, quote, out of bounds. This would be more on a galactic level than a city or planetary level.
Well, you see, the whole bit I was trying to do there was I didn't know what to say, so I'd just go into this forced existential ramble.
And what did? We joined you and said, hey, I mean, maybe you have a point there. And
I mean, yeah, but honestly, that can also be, like, a point in the horror direction. Like, how do you know it's stopped? And how do you know for sure that this isn't real?
Right. And the thing is, like, fine, invest your energy in that narrative, but realize that the energy you use for that will distance you from the shared reality that you live in with the rest of us. Which is why sometimes, especially if you're playing mind-bending games, it is really fun and grounding to discuss them with other people. Mm-hmm. People who you know, at least digitally, as friends, and are not just some unknown entity in a chat room or whatever. I guess it would be Discord server these days.
Yeah,
oh my god, I'm old again.
Yeah.
And I never really even did the chat rooms. That was something I held myself out of because, people I can't see are frightening.
And, I mean, if you're lucky, maybe you have some people IRL like, an awesome family.
But yeah, it's like with that kind of thing, it's actually a part of Inscryption that works as an experience you have together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. The meta-narrative is something that's really fun for us to discuss together. I'm grateful for being exposed to it.
You're welcome. I'm sorry I got you into it just so late.
It's alright. It just, now you got me wondering whether I actually need to play the hex or not. And I'm like, I don't know.
I will say that if you didn't like the mechanics kind of pulling you around, at least this one has tutorials as it jumps between mechanics, because the mechanics are so wildly different from one another.
Good to know. Good to know. But yeah, we can talk about that later.
Yeah. I don't foresee us needing an episode on the Hex, but we'll see what the future holds.
Maybe, spend some time with it and, we're all hexable.
Oh my god.
I'm not even sure how to contextualize that particular pun. I'm not even sure what it was supposed to be a pun of, although it's reeking of pun.
It's flexible, hexable.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Ugh.
Well, it seems to have proved it in a different sense, where I have cursed both of you by accident.
Oh wow, a whole other hex! Alright, maybe it's best that we talk about what our next game we're going to be talking about is, because I think we're kind of winding down now. We're going to be talking about Minecraft next time, and our nostalgia about it, because we got into it really early.
We did. I'll save my oldness for the episode.
But in general, I think it's going to be a pretty fun time.
Yeah.
Don't be too enthusiastic, kid.
I just have no idea what to even say about Minecraft at this point.
Well, at least it's not for lack of material. It's for lack of coping with the material. There's a lot.
There's a lot. It's almost like Minecraft is in a near infinite world, and we're getting really, really off topic. So with that, I'll say thank you so much for watching. I'm Honeyshuckleex. You can find me on Twitch at Honeyshuckleex.
Listening.
Sorry. Yes, thank you so much for listening.
As a podcast, thank you for not watching me, and if you are watching me, stop it. I'm Sackbot Barbecue. I did the theme music for this podcast.
Thank you. And I'm Giggleklutz. I'm in charge of the blog, which we have at collabnotmultiplayer.com. And we put interesting things in there to go along with to be a companion to this episode and each episode, getting hopefully better each time. And let us know what you think of the memes.
Goodbye.